Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jeremy Peat. I'm director of the David Hume Institute, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this fifth and final seminar in our series on the professionals and the politicians. In 5 weeks, you will have heard the views of Nicola Sturgeon and the four party leaders from the other parties represented at Holyrood, and today we end on a high with Ruth Davidson, the leader of the Conservative Party, and she very kindly arranged to have the Chancellor in town earlier today, which was very thoughtful of her. And some of you I know were there, as I was this morning, and I'm sure Ruth won't mind the odd question about what he said as well as about what she's going to say. Ruth is a member of the Scottish Parliament for the Glasgow Regional List. She originally graduated from Edinburgh University and then was a BBC journalist, as well as for some years being a signaller in the Territorial Army. She left the BBC in 2009 and became actively engaged in politics around that time, before being elected in 2011, and very shortly thereafter being elected under the first one person, one vote election for a leader of the Conservative Party, and took over from Annabel Goldie. So that was on the 4th of November 2011. So it's 2 years and 5 months in, or 3 months in now. So I'm delighted that Ruth is with us. We've really enjoyed having this series. I'm immensely grateful to the Young Academy of Scotland and our 4 sponsor organisations for the support. And I'm immensely grateful to all of you for coming along. I look at the faces, and a lot of you have been here for each of our 5. Thank you very much. I hope you found it as interesting as I have. So, without further ado, I'm going to sit down and listen to our speaker this evening, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Good evening. Thank you all for this opportunity to speak to you this evening, and it is a real pleasure to be here. Tonight's lecture gives me a good opportunity to thank and to praise the David Hume Institute for the integral part it plays to our culture and our national debate. And it's good form to start an event like this one with a reference to the man himself. And happily for Conservatives, David Hume's call for scepticism and for empiricism strikes quite a firm chord. Hume it was who warned that an abstract theory plucked from nowhere might be more perfect in itself, but suits less the imperfection of human nature. That's one for Bennett Reform Scotland there. The point he was trying to make is that it's always better in the real world to heed arguments which are derived from human experience. And for Conservatives, we say amen to that, because scepticism and wariness about abstract visions are at the heart of our beliefs. Traditionally, that has meant that we have sometimes been sceptical of change for change's sake, and while it's a philosophy that stood us in good stead over the years, perhaps our more recent problem has been that in a kind of fast-changing world, our side of the argument can, if we put it rather bluntly, sometimes lack a bit of the old razzle-dazzle. If we take the current referendum debate, our opponents on the side of independence, they use all the fireworks that they have available as they try and sell us this new product. Alex Salmond does his P.T. Barnum act, and the circus will no doubt in future be full of pizzazz. By contrast, a 300-year-old union that we're defending has been around for so long that it can seem burdened by an over-familiarity. But we believe, based on our experience and our knowledge, that the union is a magnificent thing. We have to recognise that it's perhaps more challenging to make the case for continuation than for a flashy new vision, however flimsy that vision may be. And added to that, our job is made more challenging still by the rather reluctant way that our country goes around making the case for the union. In his very thoughtful speech, I thought, last week, David Cameron noted that right across the UK there's been a real unwillingness in Britain to wear our patriotism on our sleeve. We are, as the Prime Minister noted, a reticent nation, and it can seem vulgar to fly the flag, he said. Occasionally, we do surprise ourselves with a sudden glimpse or display of patriotism, but such moments do kind of remain the exception. For most of the time, many of us are, as the Prime Minister suggested, reluctant patriots and shoulder shruggers. Here in Scotland, that ambivalence often seems especially prevalent. And if we take two of my colleagues on the pro-UK side, the Liberal Democrat former Secretary of State, Michael Moore, declared last year that he didn't use the term unionist to describe himself, because he would prefer and rather be known as a devolutionist. And then last month, the Labour MP, Jim Murphy, announced that the aim during the referendum campaign was not to turn Scots into unionists, but simply to appeal to their pragmatic patriotism. Now, those views are understandable, and certainly the last thing that anybody wants in this campaign is a kind of jingoistic British nationalism. You know, compulsory singing of the national anthem at screenings of Last Night at the Proms, I think, would go down pretty badly. But I think, ironically, such ostentation would all be terribly un-British anyway. However, it is important for us, or at least I believe it's important for us, as Scots who support the Union, not to be too defensive of our ground, especially if we want to make the positive case for remaining in the UK over the coming 7 months. To celebrate our inheritance, there's a need to stand back a little and to see what previously we have taken for granted. To overcome our reluctance, there's also a need to take on some of the myths and prejudices about our union that, because of our residence, have in Scotland been allowed to gain some credibility and become the received wisdom. And I have always hoped the referendum will give us the chance to do both of these things, and I think that it will. If we seize that opportunity, I believe that it will illuminate the path towards a revived union, one which can shake off the past and can meet the future with confidence. I want to take on some of those myths and prejudices that, because of our reticence, have in Scotland been allowed to gain credibility about our union and become that accepted wisdom. Others may wish to impose a kind of unionist cringe, but we shouldn't let them. Rather, let us stand back let us stand back a little and see anew that which we have previously taken for granted. The first of these myths is the caricature that the support for the Union is somehow less than truly pro-Scottish, that it shows a rather pathetic desire to assimilate into the supposedly more dominant English culture. This myth runs deep. As the historian Colin Kidd has put it, the Scottish intelligentsia as a whole tends to view unionism as un-Scottish and inauthentic, a form of false consciousness which is passively derivative of English values, aims and interests. The fact is, however, that this has always been a nonsense view. For in truth, the Scottish unionist tradition has never seen any contradiction in a fierce loyalty both to the UK and to Scotland. As I said last year upstairs in the Royal Society, those of us who believe in Scotland's place in the United Kingdom are every bit as patriotic as those who favour independence. It may be quieter, but it runs just as deep. Another historian has suggested that our beliefs might be better thought of as nationalist unionist, or as we might put it now, a view that we should accommodate and celebrate the best of both worlds. This view was illustrated perfectly 2 weeks ago by my predecessor, Annabel, now Baroness Goldie, in her maiden speech in the House of Lords. In it, she talked of her memories as a child in Greenock. Jimmy Shand on the radio seemed to be quite prominent in that, which, you know, she was never going to listen to the Skids, I think is fair to say. But she also talked about her history lessons in primary school, her awareness of the Firth and Clyde and its huge importance as a UK naval base. She knew, she said, from an early age, that there was a United Kingdom and that Scotland was a part of it, that these were natural concomitants. She knew also that there was nothing incompatible with that partnership and with also being proudly Scottish. We, on the pro-union side, recognise that there are tensions sometimes in that dual identity. It was David Hume, after all, who once complained in a letter to a friend about the barbarians on the Thames, a phrase that most of us will have had some sympathy with at one time or another. But the point is that while Scots unionists may have felt tensions in our situation, the same way that nationalists have, we've rejected the belief that this means the union must therefore come to an end. Rather, we have upheld the fact that on this small and rainy island there is so much more that unites us than divides us. and that a union with the rest of the UK therefore makes sense. So far from being inauthentic, unionist thought in Scotland has always been mature and, I think, realistic. And there's another element too, and that element is a belief in something that is bigger than ourselves. For the pro-union cause in Scotland doesn't simply make the case that we think we might lose by leaving the UK. It also believes and knows that if we're not around so much, that the rest of the UK will lose out too. Occasionally, we like to think that it's our role to help keep the rest of this island on the right track. We believe that our obstinate, our sceptical tradition of thought, developed by Hume and by Adam Smith, deserves to be heard, and that our friends in the rest of Britain will be all the better for hearing it, thanks very much. We also believe that it should be heard not just as part of a social union, but also, and vitally, as part of a democratic union, not just on the rugby stadium terraces, but on the benches of the Houses of Parliament too. And why? Because we know that the rest of the country wouldn't hear that Scottish call so clearly if the union ended. As Rory Stewart, the MP for Penrith and the Border, put it in a speech to the House of Commons last week, people in the United Kingdom would miss Scotland for different personal reasons. Scotland's egalitarianism, its intellectual seriousness, its sense of realism, its sense of humour. I would be ashamed and embarrassed to be part of a country that did not have Scottish members of Parliament. And I believe he's right. You think of the Scots who have graced that chamber, Joe Grimond, George Younger, John Smith, Donald Dewar, and think what would have been lost had they not been there. Even Winston Churchill was the MP for Dundee. So much has been achieved together with others. So much lies ahead. Our bonds would inevitably weaken if we were without the union, and it is our belief in upholding that union that this would be to the detriment of all of us. And that is the real Scottish unionist inheritance. Far from being somehow inauthentic, it's something that is confident and altruistic and generous. The second myth is that the union is a tyranny, somehow foisted on Scotland against its will. You hear it in the way that some of the modern-day SNP figures refer to Scotland as if it were a colony. Again, this is just factually wrong, although ironically, under Alex Salmond's independence plan, we may indeed end up something a little bit like a crown dependency. In the nationalist myth, Scotland is like us. In Alex Salmond's words, a surely lodger living within a United Kingdom it isn't really part of. Well, that's nonsense. Scots aren't lodgers in this house. This is our home. The UK's successes are our successes too, and we should be proud of them. And what's more, it's a home that has always had many rooms, and our family members have always respected the differences of the people living in them. From its very beginnings, 300 years ago, the original union deal ensured that the institutions that mattered to Scotland, such as religion, such as law, were always respected for their independence, and that remains the case today. This is a house that we have been perfectly free to leave if we so choose. We all, unionists and separatists, agree that Scotland is a nation. The debate centres on the choice either to remain as a partner in the UK nation state or to sue for divorce. As Professor Adam Tompkins at Glasgow University writes, we are all nationalists, the argument runs, in that we all recognise that Scotland is a nation. The argument between us is whether Scotland should separate from the rest of the UK to become an independent state. We take this unique and remarkable voluntary nature of our union for granted. It is, in fact, a wonderful thing, a benevolent, enduring, a democratic friendship. And if you look, for example, at the way that this referendum is being conducted, a democratic vote in Scotland in 2011 saw the SNP win a majority. And while the SNP ironically seemed reluctant to accept the consequences of this, the rest of the UK did not. It understood that the choice of the people meant that Scotland now had the right to vote on whether to separate from the UK and form a new country. It understood that in our peculiarly great nation, 5 million people should be able to decide whether or not the nation of 60 million people should continue to exist or not. we don't make enough of this. Arturo Mas, the head of the devolved government in Catalonia, told the BBC just last month, "We envy a little bit what is happening in the UK. What we would like is an agreement with the central Spanish institutions. The difference is that in Spain, the central government institutions say you don't have a right to vote." Now, I don't expect Alex Salmond to be quite as generous over the coming months, but you do have to ask, when he continually goes on about the alleged unfairness of the UK, what kind of unfairness is it? Once again, the Union has shown that far from being a constraining or a restrictive force, it is a responsive and a tolerant, and above all, a voluntary one. The Catalans seem to understand it, but because of our reticence, somehow we haven't. And the third myth is that the Union is a drag on its many component parts, a country where London shouts jump and the rest of us all have to ask, how high? And again, the facts suggest otherwise. The Conservatives are often caricatured as the Unionist party which sought to impose a London-centric view. It's worth pointing out, therefore, that it was a Conservative government that was behind the creation of the Scottish Office and the new post of Secretary for Scotland in the late 19th century. It was also a Conservative government which elevated the job to the level of Secretary of State in the 1920s. Now, of course, those reforms in administrative devolution were not enough, and only in 1999 did the country get the democratic devolution it clearly wanted. And we're moving on again. The Scotland Act, one of the first pieces of legislation by this coalition government, will provide a further tranche of powers over the coming years to Holyrood. It is the single biggest transfer of fiscal powers since the Union began. Elsewhere, Wales's call for more control is also being heard. And the sleeping giant of regional government is now being awoken. With this government prepared to drive power towards the great cities and out of the London metropolis. And we hope that cities in Scotland, like my own city of Glasgow, will be among those taking advantage of the new city deals being reviewed by this government, deals which would offer them far-reaching powers to grow their own economies. And as for the future shape of a devolved Scotland, the Scottish Conservative Party is changing, and we are leading the calls for a more responsible Parliament in Edinburgh. Let me say first a few things on this issue. Last year I made two commitments. The first was to examine the domestic powers currently held by the Westminster Parliament to assess objectively whether they were best retained in Whitehall or devolved to Holyrood. And secondly, I made a commitment to publish our plans on this issue before September's referendum so that the people of Scotland would know what we were proposing before they vote. The work on this is ongoing. In May, a commission that is led by Lord Strathclyde will report back to me on its findings on how to improve the devolution settlement. We will then provide our detailed response so that people can be clear about what it is that we plan to do. It is not for me tonight to second-guess Lord Strathclyde's findings, but let me make just a couple of points clear. I've heard it claimed that our proposals to advance devolution are something of a political game, that it's about buying off the Nats. That could not be further from the truth, and it misunderstands our core values entirely. Conservatives instinctively want responsibility and accountability to be at the heart of our institutions. We recoil when institutions appear to wield power with arrogance. We feel that there is something wrong when our precious freedoms are not tempered and tethered by accountability to society at large. And so when a parliament decides upon the allocation of huge sums of money, but is only accountable for a small portion of it, Conservatives will instinctively question that system. We want to ask, how do we ensure a politician in that parliament cannot abrogate the responsibility to society? Or, as we have seen in our own parliament, how do we avoid one government spending taxpayers' money in Edinburgh and then blaming another in Westminster for the fact it doesn't have any more? The fact is, as I said last year, a parliament with little responsibility for raising the money it spends will never be properly accountable to the people of Scotland. It can never have the vital incentive to cut the size or the cost of government or to reduce tax bills. So we must deal with this. Not to give Alex Salmond any sort of consolation prize, but because we want the institution of the Scottish Parliament to work, and to work in the interests of the people of Scotland, not its politicians. We will deal with this, And we will do so confident in the knowledge that it is the eccentric genius of the Union to be able to accommodate such change while keeping the essential character intact. We do not live in a union which jealously clings power to its chest. Not ever, not now. It is a mature union, one which is and has always been open to change and to testing where power best lies. Scotland's history as a nation within the Union is one that has allowed freedom of movement, of trade, of expression to flourish, not here, but everywhere. And in the fact that it is this referendum debate which is now helping to establish those truths more clearly. Despite our reluctance to bang on about it, slowly we are beginning to rediscover institutions which underpin everything that we do. That sentence on every pound note, promising to pay the bearer on demand, not something we ever think about until we realise that it might be taken away. The knowledge that the clout of 60 million people is there to back us up if, in the worst times, a bank with billions on its books suddenly goes bust. Not something we ever think about until we realise that they might not be there. And those magnificent words on the inside cover of our passports, informing people that our Britannic Majesty's Secretary of State requests and requires, in the name of Her Majesty, all those to whom it may concern, to allow the bearer to pass freely without let or hindrance, and to afford the bearer such assistance and protection as may be necessary. 185 embassies, consuls and commissions peppered all over the globe. Such institutions are part of our nation's tapestry. Like the environment, this shared union strength is something that we have taken for granted, right up to the point where it is suddenly threatened. Now, of course, we would say that, but the most convincing and ironic proof of this comes from the fact that it's actually been our opponents on the pro-independence side who have been forced to acknowledge these bedrock strengths as well. It was Alex Salmond who last summer said he wanted to keep most of the ties that link us with the rest of the UK. A clear acknowledgement that far from being broken, the bonds that link us on this island are vital to our future prosperity. His sudden conversion to a form of unionism then hit its peak in November, when safely out of the public eye on a visit to Hong Kong, he sought to play up Scotland's business strengths by declaring that it shared not just a time zone and a language, but also a regulatory system with London, and that Scotland's worth as an investment destination was in part predicated on its close links with the UK capital. His audience must have wondered that if Scotland had been independent now, would Alex Salmond be leading the campaign for a union with the rest of the UK? And it's not just on financial services. On issues as diverse as the currency and the Grangemouth standoff last autumn, the nationalists have been forced, far from pledging a different and brighter future, simply to reassure us that things after independence will not remove the security and strength that we enjoy right now. Faced with the facts and the polls, the entertaining truth is that the argument for separation has been forced to go around telling us that we should keep together. This rather odd state of affairs can be illustrated by responding to some of the specific questions that has been raised by the RSC Young Academy for this lecture series. Firstly, you asked me to examine how we best ensure Scotland's economy will boost employment and boost business. I think the first thing to say is that the good news, and it is good news, is that the recovery is underway. Last month's IMF figures concluded that the UK economy will grow more than any other in Europe this year, higher than Germany, higher than France. But not just Europe, higher too than Japan, than Canada, than Russia, and even Brazil. The speed of that growth is also outpacing our neighbours, and with the British economy now expanding faster than at any time since the crash in 2007. It is now beginning to feed through into the real world. We learned last month that unemployment has dropped to 7.1% across the UK, 6.4% here in Scotland, the lowest figure for 5 years. Real jobs for real people. And further encouraging figures have shown that it is manufacturing that is leading the way, up nearly 1 percentage point in the last 3 months of 2013. Our vital service sector, too, is back with a bang, contributing the lion's share of our return to economic health. Now, we know that there is a very long way to go. Britain's debts still need to be tackled. Our public services and welfare system require further reform. But having survived the storm, made tough choices, taken some pretty strong medicine, Britain is now in pole position to make the most out of a renewed period of growth. We could beat China and the USA as a source for foreign direct investment. Indeed, by 2030, some forecasters are predicting that the UK, the whole UK, will become the EU's largest economy. All of this proves that we all, Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland, are benefiting from being part of this, the oldest and most successful single market in the world, a market copper-bottomed by a currency whose value nobody questions. Here in Scotland, that stability is a springboard for our exports. Sales of Scotch whisky abroad now exceed £4 billion a year, a quarter of the UK's entire food and drink sector. And that internal market also provides Scotland with massive opportunities. Statistics published just last week show that out of £73.6 billion of non-oil exports from Scotland, a total of £47.6 billion goes to the rest of the UK. As any small businessman will tell you, it's still a lot easier to sell to our friends in this country than it is even within the supposed single market of Europe. Therefore, we cannot risk complications that might place the important simplicity at peril. The big job ahead of us now is to keep that recovery going. To maintain stability, we must deal with our debts. To boost the economy, we must continue to support small businesses and cut taxes. There isn't a shortcut back to economic growth. What we need right now is to maintain our course, to have the confidence to show the world that we are open for business. Now, these strengths have become all too apparent in the referendum debate, and so the response from the SNP has been, well, we agree. The currency, they want it to stay the same. The UK-wide free market, keep it going. A UK-wide financial regulation system, we'll have that too, thank you very much. The same borrowing and debt limits, no problem. And it all kind of begs the question, if this system is so great, what is the reason for putting it all at risk through separation? It is the SNP peculiarly which is helping us to make the case for the union here. The second point that the Young Academy asked me to consider was a point about university funding. And again, the way the referendum debate has progressed has indeed helped us make this case. As with the economy, the background here is a set of current constitutional arrangements which ensure that the universities in Scotland all benefit from a broad international reputation and the added clout that Britain provides. There is no doubt about these pluses. The wider pool of the UK ensures that researchers and our universities can collaborate together in a highly integrated system with no notice given to where they are based. And this is an increasingly important factor, given the fact that these days universities increasingly get judged according to their research and their collaborative projects. The beauty of the current setup, however, is also that it gives space for institutions in Scotland to ensure their distinct character, their history, their intellectual pedigree, and that is promoted and valued. And the figures suggest that we are thriving as a result. In cash terms, in 2012-13, Scottish universities secured £257 million of UK funding research grants. That's 13% of the UK total, much higher than our 8.4% population share. As for how to evolve funding streams and boost higher education in the future, we need to see universities, businesses and the public sector working together to produce added value, creating spin-out companies and harnessing their intellectual clout. If we take the example in my own constituency of Strathclyde University, it's the current UK Entrepreneurial University of the Year. It's created more than 50 spin-out companies, making annual sales of £80 million and employing more than 700 people. In this referendum debate, we are all united in wanting our universities to flourish in the same manner. And speaking to you last month, Nicola Sturgeon said that she did too. She said she hoped to see continued cooperation in this area of research funding across the UK. But as it is with the economy, we therefore have to ask, if that really is the SNP's view, then why demand that the political ties that help that continued cooperation be severed? Why stop MPs from Scotland working with others from the UK to help construct policy and ensure that that cooperation deepens? So yes, while there will always be disagreements between universities and government over the best way to run our affairs, the referendum debate has so far shown clearly that the union helps and not hinders. In both of these examples, therefore, the SNP argument has paradoxically helped to show up the underlying value of our union. And this is helping our cause greatly. But their growing problem is that their attempt to square independence off against union success stories isn't working, and in fact, it's beginning to fall apart. In truth, we're beginning to learn is that the pick and mix independence approach just doesn't work. You can't just choose the bits that you like out of the UK and leave the bits that you don't. Firstly, it's not the experience elsewhere, even in the so-called European single market. Trade barriers are rife, as any Scottish insurance firm will tell you. And while the SNP may insist that it's scaremongering to claim, for example, that immigration controls would emerge between Scotland and England after independence, that is the logic of their position if the two nations end up with wholly different policies. The fundamental problem with the SNP's version of independence is that, as Professor Jim Gallagher has put it, our three unions, our economic, social and political unions, rely upon each other. They are, he says, interconnected, and you cannot simply cut away the political union and hope to keep the others. It is a three-legged stool, and a stool of basic common sense position. Our social ties have been founded on economic and political union. Our economic ties need political democratic legitimacy to work. If you don't support that principle, it leads you into some truly bizarre positions. The SNP now argues, for example, that Scotland should have no representation in Westminster. This despite the fact that it wants to keep the pound, the Bank of England and the UK safety net. Why? Shouldn't there be Scottish MPs there if, as the SNP says, it wants macroeconomic policy run from London? And what is the logic of not having MPs at Westminster but desperately wishing to have MEPs in Brussels? Does anybody in the SNP have an answer? These are the contortions that the nationalist cause has now wrapped itself up in. And by contrast, our case, economic, social, political union, is simple and it makes sense. As the SNP only now seems to be realising, in our integrated United Kingdom, we need those bonds. And if they weren't there, it would be necessary to invent them. The logic of a currency pact, as the Eurozone has shown us, is that tax, spending and borrowing plans must also be agreed. In other words, if you want to keep the pound, you need to keep the union. I'm sure all of you have caught up with George Osborne's words today, and along with both Labour and Liberal Democrat finance spokesmen, he has confirmed that the UK could not in all conscience go into a Eurozone-style pact with an independent Scotland, with all of the risk that it entails. After all, we've all seen where that ends up. The Chancellor's case was admirably reasoned. That's in stark contrast to the disarray within the SNP. They now appear to be in a kind of gnat twilight zone, where they end up pleading to stay within certain unions, while people like the Chancellor, who spell out the consequences of genuine independence, are accused of bullying. The fact is that today will go down as an enormously significant moment. The day that the veil was finally drawn back on Alex Salmond's flimsy prospectus, for reality, I believe, has finally hit home. If you want to listen to the words of the Treasury's impartial Permanent Secretary, Sir Nicholas Macpherson, released today alongside the Chancellor's speech, this is his unbiased advice to the Chancellor. Currency unions between sovereign states, he warns, are fraught with difficulty. The great thing about the current setup, he adds, is that it has all the necessary ingredients: political union, economic integration and consent. By contrast, he says, what worries me about the Scottish Government's putative currency union is that it would take place against the backdrop of a weakening union between the two countries, running counter to the direction of travel in the Eurozone. I would advise strongly against a currency union as currently advocated if Scotland were to vote for independence. Those words are utterly devastating to the nationalist myth that they can have it all. And frankly, they expose Alex Salmond's Walter Mitty plan for Scotland for what it is. For a decade, Alex Salmond's fraudulent attempt to de-risk independence has managed to stagger along. And today, finally, that flimsy case has come crashing down around his ears. And we're left with a very simple fact. If you want a currency union, it's called the United Kingdom. leave the UK and you leave the UK pound. That's the reality. That's what's worked. That, as Hume would have it, is our knowledge based on our experience. And it's one that the majority of people in Scotland appear to back. So to conclude, this referendum is helping us to rebuild the arguments that we should have been making for years. The negative historic connotations of our union are based on falsehoods that need to be exposed. The advantages of our modern-day union in areas like university funding, in areas like the economy, are numerous and are accepted even by our opponents. The point is that if even separatists feel the need to spell out the benefits of union in order to get a hearing in this debate, then perhaps it is time for those of us on our side to be a little more vocal and a little more proud of it too. Our union will never be perfect. We've made plenty of mistakes, but the fact would suggest that it has, over the last 300 years, held up incredibly well. That basic point is hard to counter. And as the Prime Minister asked 2 years ago, imagine trying to explain to an Australian or an American what was so awful about this country that it had to be broken up. Our union, he said rightly, is a modern union. It's one that evolves, one that protects us, one that allows our different nations to grow stronger because we share the same secure foundations. For us in Scotland, the union has always been flexible and open. Scottish institutions and values have always had a voice. Scotland is not now, nor has ever been, North Britain. And as we face the future, a new era of devolution ahead of us shows that we are all prepared to change once again and embark on another exciting journey together, rooted in our common values and the strength of our shared beliefs. The time has now come for pro-unionists to throw off their queasiness about defending and advancing our position. We can be, sometimes I feel, a bit like home fans satisfied at a football match, and we sit there watching our team quietly and happily while most of the shouting comes from the small contingent of away supporters that are in the corner of the stadium. Perhaps the voice of the majority in Scotland and the rest of the UK will never be quite as vociferous as our opponents in this debate. And history shows that that has never really been our way. But we have everything to be proud of in the way our union has evolved. And while we may not shout it from the rooftops, we all should acknowledge the good that it has brought to Scotland. I always hoped that this referendum would be an opportunity to vote not out of fear or negativity, but out of hope for a brighter future in a renewed nation. To talk of what we love, of what we share, of what we've accomplished, and how much bigger we can dream if we dream together. And that remains my belief today. For those of us in this campaign, it's now in our hands to defend our union, to celebrate it, and to revive it anew for another 300 years to come. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed for another very thoughtful and thought-provoking talk. Now we have plenty of time for questions, and two ladies with mics have miraculously appeared. So who would like to start us off? There's a gentleman at the back and then a couple forward. So if we take the gentleman at the back first, then we'll pick up a couple more. And if you could do me the kindness of saying who you are as you start.
I'm Derek Scott. I'm a pension trustee. A comment on the Chancellor and probably the Treasury. Westminster Chancellors have previous form. You only have to think about Gordon Brown selling the gold reserves in 1999 and 2000. And I even wonder what the current Chancellor's thinking of doing, of selling banks just when they're about to start paying dividends. But that's more of a comment. The question really is, you talked about the growth of the UK, and I think as recently as this week, the Governor of the Bank of England introduced a new concept about growth when he said it wasn't balanced. Now, I took out of that it wasn't balanced regionally, fairly, socially, in an acceptable way. So I'd be interested in your view on that. Thank you.
Thank you. My take on it, for what it's worth, was, as you could have read in my Herald article 2 weeks ago, that the balance problem was one of an overemphasis on consumption growth and an underemphasis on investment and indeed on all items that lead to enhanced productivity within our economy, and increasing consumption being the foundation for growth at a time when that was driven by increased debt, when we were trying to write off debt, and real incomes were still falling was the problem. But that's just my interpretation of it.
If I may, Derek, first of all, I'm, as you can imagine, as a Conservative politician, not going to defend Gordon Brown's sell-off of the gold. I think, and you wouldn't expect me to, but I think in terms of your substantive point about the Governor of the Bank of England, we don't have to guess what he was trying to say, nor do we have to read the excellent article that Jeremy managed to plug for you and is available on the www.heraldscotland.web website. He went on to say what he meant by unbalanced growth, and he did talk about short-term consumer spending and an uplift in that, and wanted to talk about the firm foundations and how things like the increase in services, in agriculture and manufacturing, while they were ticking up, it hadn't happened over a large enough number of quarters for us to say that that was sustained growth. I believe that our economy following the crash did need to be rebalanced, and this is a political point, not a banker's point, in terms of where some of the division of payments were. So, for example, reducing the number of public sector jobs and increasing the number of private sector jobs, I think helps to rebalance the economy in a way in which people can understand out there. So Dr. Carney, as you know, is trying to have quite an open version of governance at the Bank of England. I think that's to the benefit of everybody across the whole of the UK, that we don't only see the decisions that are made at the Bank of England, but we also see some of the thought processes behind the decisions that are being made, and that can guide institutions like some of the pension trustees, such as yourself, Derek, going forward. And, it is early days, but I think given where we have come from and given the problems that are faced by some of the other countries that are out there that suffered similarly to us, we have taken some strong medicine and we are beginning to turn the corner, and I think that we should recognise that and watch as that kind of filters down to real people and real jobs and real lives.
Okay, let's take a couple more. There's Ben Thompson there, and if the lady can bring the microphone forward to gentleman from the Youth Parliament that I recognise. Yes.
Ruth, hi.
Hi, Ben.
Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Thank you for your comments. Particularly, I'm interested to see that the campaign is going to be fought on a positive approach, because so far, I think probably people would feel that it's slightly negative approach has been adopted. But what I wanted to focus on in your speech was you said some very interesting comments about city deals and localism to local government and your commitment to local government. And I wonder if you can give me a little bit more of the vision, or us a little bit more of the vision about what localism really means to you, and whether, like England, Scottish cities will be given the chance to vote for their own mayors, that local policing will be passed back to local government rather than being centralised as it has been in the last few years, whether or not the cap on council tax rates will be removed and local governments being given revenue powers such as business rates or property taxes back again. So I'd like to see, I totally agree with the vision about getting back to localism and decentralising power, but it'd be nice to see some sort of firm policies of what that actually means, and whether those will be made clearer as we come up to the referendum.
Let's just take the second question now, if we may.
Hi there, I'm Jamie. I'm a member of the Scottish Youth Parliament, and I also work for an MSP in Holyrood. My question is, you've spoken about a very positive vision of the union, and about how in this debate unionists often are on the back foot defending the 300-year-old institution. But do you not think it's very difficult for the Conservative and Unionist Party in Scotland to make the vision, because so much of the debate has been between the Labour Party in Scotland and the kind of very loud left-wing side of the Yes campaign about how we can achieve a socially just Scotland? And do you think the Conservatives can often add a sour taste to the no side in that? Thank you.
Two interesting questions.
Okay. Start with Ben and some of the specifics that were there. When you're talking about localism and local government, our vision for that as Conservatives has always been that trying to push power as close to the people who are affected by changes in that as possible, and that does mean empowering local authorities to a certain degree. In terms of city mayors, my predecessor Annabel Goldie had this in a previous manifesto. I think she called them provosts rather than mayors, because mayors is a particularly English expression, but we would like to see more powers passed to people in that respect. One of our great problems with the reform of policing, and one of the reasons that we didn't vote for the bill, to combine the police forces in Scotland, was because there wasn't local oversight. And we believe that not having that oversight at a local level to talk about local crime concerns is a huge step backwards in Scottish justice and Scottish policing. And we felt we were completely unable to back the bill. Ourselves and the Liberal Democrats chose to step away, whereas Labour and the SNP thought that the reformed police force was a good idea. In terms on council tax rates, our vision within the Scottish Conservatives had been to have a freeze up until 2013. As you will see, this is no longer 2013. We have that policy under review. I think there is a real argument for there being local control over spending and revenue raising. And I think we're seeing, with what's happening, for example, in Aberdeen wanting to come out of COSLA, you're seeing real tensions that have maybe been kept under wraps in local authorities in recent years coming to the fore. And in terms of business rates, again, if you go back to our 2012 local government manifesto, we did want councils to be able to keep and use more of the business rates that they had in order to encourage them to make themselves pro-business communities. So on all of the issues that you've individually raised, that is something that has been in Conservative thinking. Now, I fully accept that we perhaps haven't maybe able to get that across to people as a whole package up until now. It's my job to continue doing that going forward. But I think we've seen a huge amount of centralisation in Edinburgh in the last 7 years, particularly of this SNP government. And I think that there needs to be a rebalance to that. And I also believe, coming from a very rural community where I grew up, that somehow and sometimes Edinburgh can feel every bit as far away from kith and kin as London can. And if you are living in a community that's not benefiting from central belt infrastructure spending, or you don't have a good broadband line, or even in some parts of the Scottish borders, you still don't have a good phone connection. You still feel pretty far away from the spend that's happening in a modern Scotland, and you feel disempowered by that. So I do believe in invoking, in raising the sleeping dragon, I think I called it in the speech, of local accountability. And I would support the city deals that are going on down south being available in Scotland, and I would hope that the SNP would be able to see the benefit of that, although I don't hold my breath. Jamie, in terms of the positive vision, I do believe in the United Kingdom, and I understand that when people have done lots of polling and research, and you've seen sort of newspapers talking about the undecideds being swung by whether they'd be £1,000 richer or £1,000 poorer, or £500 richer or £500 poorer. That makes me very sad, because to me, my country and my identity is more than just money. It's more than just the pound in your pocket. And while I will always go out and make the economic arguments, and I believe that they're very strong, we export twice as much to the rest of the UK as we, export to the rest of the world. We have a strength in our economy, a durability, our ability to absorb shocks because we're part of the UK. I don't think that should blind us to the idea of identity in this debate as well. I am Scottish, but I'm British too. And Alex Salmond wants to take that bit of me that's British away from me, and I don't know what I'm getting back for that. And I genuinely believe, when I look at some of the things that we've done around the world, that we should be proud of who we are and what we've achieved. Jeremy mentioned that before I was elected, I used to be a reporter. I used to be a journalist. When I was a very, very young journalist back in 2001, I was sent to Kosovo to cover the work that some of our Scottish troops were doing there. I was stationed with the Black Watch in the capital of Kosovo, Pristina. And I saw lads that went to my school, Buckhaven High School, patrolling the streets, protecting children, stopping a genocide that was there to wipe out a whole people. And I saw the force for good that the UK can be in the world. And I'm proud of that, and I'm proud of the Scottish contribution to that. And we see it in so many other areas of life as well. And I think, if you look at the debates, there is a clear strategy, I believe, from the Nationalists to try and out-left the Labour Party. But Scotland has always had a strong small c conservative wing. I mean, there's a reason why the SNP dropped their Penny from Scotland campaign. It's because people in Scotland don't want to pay more tax, same as everybody else. And if you look at some of the social attitude surveys that we've seen in Scotland, there isn't the false division that the SNP try and create between Scottish people and English people. Our attitudes aren't that different. Now, you know, we may have different voting patterns, but even if you look at the last general election, you know, the Scottish Conservatives got between 400,000 and 500,000 votes. So did the SNP. You know, and the coalition government got more votes in 2010 than Alex Salmond for First Minister did in 2011 when he got his majority. You know, it's double the number of seats. So, you know, in terms of talking about a democratic deficit, I understand why the Nationalists try and play that card, but I just don't think the numbers add up.
Thank you very much.
Does that cover your point, Jamie? Yeah, good.
Now we've got a gentleman sitting in the middle there, if we can get the mic there, and a lady at the front here, if we can bring it down. So let's take those two, and then there was a lady just behind, I think, who will coming soon. Okay.
Hello.
It's on.
Right.
If you could give your name, please.
Hamish Mackenzie, representing myself only. You've talked about the benefit of the size of the United Kingdom, and this is a positive thing. But is it not the case that some of the most prosperous and happiest nations in Europe are actually small ones? Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland in particular, and Switzerland, with, of course, big enough to have its own banks. And in this context, our Prime Minister is, in fact, in a sense, trying to repatriate, is he not, from the European Union to some extent, using some arguments that seem to me that are in contrast to the arguments he's using to oppose Scottish independence.
Okay, thank you. And lady here.
Packard. Any government needs an effective opposition. A unicameral parliament has perhaps different forms of checks and balances, and I wonder if you could please give your view, or share your view with us all, sorry, on checks and balances in the event of independence and checks and balances in the event of a continued union, when probably more responsibilities and different practices will evolve and emerge.
Thank you. So small is beautiful.
Well, as somebody who's only 5'5", I couldn't agree more. In terms of the size of nation states, however, yes, I understand that there are some, GDP that is higher in some small nations and some GDP that is higher in some big nations too. I don't think it's the size of your country that necessarily dictates how individually wealthy people will be. I think, Norway in particular has certain advantages going for it that other countries may not have in terms of its oil revenue, which far outstrips per head of population our own. However, I think there are clear advantages in being a bigger nation. There are clear advantages in being part of the G7, the G8, in being able to have a stability that is recognised in the world. And if you look at, for example, the bank bailouts, it mattered that it was the UK that was doing it, because when you have, banks that have a balance sheet that's 13 times the size of a national economy, you need a bigger nation to stand behind it, and you only need to look at the difference between the UK's ability to bail out RBS and the Bank of Scotland and what happened with Landesbanki in Iceland, a country that didn't have the ability to bail out its own banks. And the difference is as well, the Icelandic banks were only 6 or 7 times the size of their national economy. 13 times the size of Scotland's economy is huge, and you have to have somebody that's able to stand behind that. So I do think that there are huge advantages in being one of the sort of bigger nations. And I think your sort of slight side point about repatriation of powers within the European Union. I think that if the countries of the Eurozone are going to have a negotiation and discussing about changing their terms of involvement with the EU, that I think that it is only right, proper and fair that non-Eurozone countries also get a chance to review the way in which they engage with the EU. And I don't think that the Prime Minister is out of step with other countries in Europe in this. We've heard the Foreign Minister of the Czech Republic. We've heard ministers from within the Polish government. We've seen just this week Switzerland repatriate powers over immigration. And while it's not in the EU, it has an arrangement with the EU that has always included the free movement of goods and people. So we are beginning to see people questioning closer political integration as a result of some of the economic issues that have hit the EU. And on a wholly different point, on a unicameral parliament and checks and balances, yes, I think there is an issue. I think when you had the Scottish Parliament set up, as we know, under the D'Hondt system, there was never supposed to be a majority government. We have seen what that can do to the Parliament. It has caused some problems. One of the things that I've asked the Strathclyde Commission to look at is how the Parliament works better, as well as what it is that it has under its control. I think there are some small things as well as big things that could change to make things better. I think if you're going to have a system wherein the committees, the parliamentary committees, are supposed to have power over the final legislation, you have to empower those committees better. You also have to make sure that it's not stuffed by party placement, which is very easy to do at the moment. You know, it is the party that decides who sits on any individual committee. You also need a system where the committee conveners are much more independent of the parties which they come from, in the same way as a speaker is supposed to be independent within a house. This is something that to her great credit, the current presiding officer has recognised as well, and she is looking at bringing forward ways in which we can change the makeup of the way the Parliament works in order to try and bring forward that kind of independence and a kind of scrutiny, which I think it has been all too able to be seen has been lost in many ways. If you look at some of the legislation that's come out of the Scottish Parliament since majority government, a lot of it has been imperfect, to say the least. I think, for example, things like the what's called the sectarian bill, the one that looks at sectarian chanting at football matches, that looks at online communications, is a hugely flawed bill. And the amount of work that the sadly now departed David McLetchie put in to try and add amendments both at parliamentary committee stage, because when he sat in the Justice Committee, and at several stages beyond there, in the final stage at stage 3, to try and rescue what is, frankly, I believe, a dog's dinner of a bill that has caused more harm than it has created benefit. You know, it was just ridden roughshod over, and there was no space for that voice to be there. And he was a very important voice. And I notice Michael from the Michael Clancy from the Law Society down here. I know the Law Society as an institution gave evidence to the committee as well, talking about how that bill could be improved. But sadly, no improvements did there come. So there are ways in which the Scottish Parliament can be improved. I think it needs improvement. I don't believe you should have a Scottish House of Lords. I think most people in Scotland would cry if there was another tier of government brought into Scotland. But I do think the Parliament can work better than it does. And I think we should aspire to have it work better than it does, both in majority or in coalition or in minority government terms.
Can I just pick you up on one particular point about Anne's question, which Anne's raised it with the other part, most of the other party leaders, and I think it's a fascinating point. One thing that's happening at the moment is consideration of John Swinney's commitment to introduce something akin to the Office of Budget Responsibility in Scotland. And I was reading the other day the report that's come out of the Finance Committee on the proposal. Now, what I found interesting is that Mr. Osborne, who is here today as your warm-up act, he faces a set of figures coming out of the OBR in London, which will be the economic forecasts, and from them the public finance figures, that he has to take into account in his budget. Now, the equivalent in Scotland, the paper discusses whether the Scottish equivalent should likewise produce the forecasts, or whether it should be allowed simply to comment on forecasts prepared by the Scottish government. Now, given some of the figures in the white paper and elsewhere, do you think it would be appropriate for a Scottish Office of Budget Responsibility to have the same powers as that in the UK? Or would you be satisfied with one that simply commented on figures produced by the Scottish Government?
Well, First of all, I think if you found any figures in the white paper, you were doing pretty well, because out of the 670 pages that are in that document, and believe you me, I have read it more than once, there is one table, one page of figures and analysis. And while there are some numbers liberally smattered in some of the prose that is written in between, it doesn't go past a projection for 14-15, which I find rather interesting.
Related to the next budget round, then.
Absolutely. I have to put my hand up and say you're ahead of me, Jeremy. I haven't read that report that's come out of the Finance Committee into this Office of Budget Responsibility. But I do believe in the principle of having a more rigorous view of what happens in Scotland. I think we should look at the institutions that we have and see if they could be doing with being strengthened or whether they work well. I think, for example, Audit Scotland is one of the better institutions that we have, and in terms of some of the work that it puts out, I think it is a real kind of terrier snapping at the heels of government in many ways. And I'm willing to look at the proposal that's there, but if you're going to have something like this, you're going to have to give it teeth.
I'm delighted to hear that, and I have a look, and I'm happy to chat with you elsewhere. Let's take a couple.
That sounds like a fascinating dinner conversation for later.
A couple more questions. There's a lady back there, and we'll take the gentleman here, and then we'll move. Right. So if we can take, if the well, the gentleman's got the mic, so he can go first, and then the lady. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name's Ian MacDonald, and I'm in business, and I've worked in Europe, in Brussels, and I worked in England for 20 years, and I'm firmly in the Better Together camp.
Good man.
I like the arguments. I think they're sophisticated. They are very interesting, challenging, but complex. I have a young friend who's an activist on the other side, and she has been out campaigning with an army of hundreds of others for the Yes campaign. And I'm worried about that, and I wonder if you worry about that, and if there's some reason why I should be less worried than I am. I'd like to hear about it.
Are you worried because it's a young lady out there, or because there are so many of them?
Possibly, there's a lot of them.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Thank you. My name's Aileen Fife. I'm a member of the Young Academy and also a historian. And I've been enjoying listening to you making reference to the history of the Union. Here. And quoting from various of my colleagues, so I've been having fun. But then I was struck at the very end when you made a reference to North Britain and said that you didn't want to be. And as a Victorian historian, I quite like the phrase North Britain because I think it reminds us that if you've got Scotland and England, not all of England, or in fact not all the rest of the UK, is London and the home counties. One of the things that North Britain does is remind us of the links between Scotland and the north of England, or Northern Ireland or Wales. And I was therefore a little surprised, given the historical content earlier, that you were so adamant against it. So I'm just curious.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, Ian, first of all, let me tell you that the Better Together side has also got hundreds of activists up and down the country. It has nearly 300 groupings that are involved because of the way the Electoral Commission structured the way in which the campaigns are allowed to go out and spend money and promote either side. Individual political parties have to do some work as well. So while the Conservatives are fully committed to Better Together and are involved in that, about 2 years ago now, almost 2 years ago, I set up a campaign group called Conservative Friends of the Union, which would help drive the bit that we had to do that had to be kind of separate, of which we have more than 80,000 members, people that physically wrote to us to say we want to be involved, we want to do our bit in the community. Now, the Scottish Conservatives, I don't know if anyone in the room has noticed, is not the biggest political party in Scotland right now. I'm working on that. That's my job. That's not your worry, Ian. But, that was a huge response because there are so many people that want to be involved. And the point that I was trying to make about the kind of football grounds was that what I used is people on the unionist side of the argument, poll after poll are showing, are in the majority. They just aren't talking about it as much as the other side. And that should worry us because it means that there's a lot of work going on. But I promise you, going door to door to door, we're doing it too. I am not complacent. I think the polls will narrow between now and September. But I think that the good people of Scotland will have the good sense to see how much we have and how much we stand to lose if we take a punt in the dark. And I think for me, what's astonishing that after 80 years of advocating for independence, after more than 2 years now of a campaign, is that the SNP still don't have the answers to some of the really basic questions. The really basic questions. And I was struck when I was listening to, when I was in the Point Hotel with Jeremy and others, and Michael and others today, listening to the Chancellor, who, because he's from down south and isn't involved every single day in this debate in the same way that politicians up here are, can take a slightly sort of removed view from it. The clarity of talking about things like, you say you want a currency union, but you don't say you'll have that forever. Now, markets abroad need to know that you will have, that you're committed to that and you won't just change in 5 or 10 years' time and then go it alone after that. You know, the white paper says that that's subject to the will of the people of Scotland. You might have a referendum, we might change that. So you know, seeing that there are really big questions. You know, you don't know if you're going to get your pension in pounds or gross or euros or whatever. You know, that shows just the risk that's involved. And as I said before, you know, I don't want to run a scare campaign. That's not what I believe my role in this campaign is. And it's not what I'm comfortable doing. This isn't what I believe. I don't believe that's the argument that we should be making. We should be talking up what we've done, acknowledging our mistakes where there have been some, but talking up exactly what it is that we've built together. And we did build it together. We can't point at the UK and say, it's flawed and that's the English fault. And we should therefore take our ball and our goalposts and our jumpers and run away. See, we've built that and it's flawed, but it's marvellous too. And it's marvellous too because we helped build it. And I am proud. I am genuinely proud of being British as well as Scottish. And I'm Scottish first, and I've never lived or worked anywhere else, and I've never really wanted to. You know, I travel extensively and I love seeing the world, but this is my home. And I think my home would be changed irrevocably for not being part of the United Kingdom. And that's what I believe my role is in the next 7 months, is to make people see that. On a completely, I've waxed lyrical on a completely different note, Ailey, I'm not a historian. My degree is largely in Scottish literature. As you know, there's a great book by a Candy McWilliam called The Debatable Lands. I would gladly scoop up most of the debatable lands and put them in Scotland. That's the lands that are just over the border. My sister lives in Gosforth, so I'd quite like her to be in the same side of any wall as me. But I don't know, I think the idea of North Britain, it kind of makes me sort of wince a little bit. And that's purely personal. I'm sure it's purely personal, just because, do you know what? Being Scottish is so much of who I am, and having so many friends that come from different parts of not just this country, but others too. You know, there is a kind of chippy pride about being Scottish. There is a particular humour that we have. There is a kind of couthy grace and a generosity and like all of these things that make up what being Scottish is. And I don't think that being North British encapsulates that. I don't think saying I'm North British means that you fight people at a bar to be able to stand the first round in the way that Scots do. And you know, and that's what I love about my country, amongst all of the other things that I love. And I just think that being Scottish and that sense of identity and the sense of nuance that there is with that and all of the things that go along with it, do you know, it's fantastic, and it's recognised the world over. You know, you go to other countries and you say, no, I'm not English, I'm Scottish, and immediately people warm to you. And so, yeah, so I guess it's purely personal choice. You can be North British for as long as you like, Ely, but I am definitely and proudly a Scot, and I will always remain so. So thank you.
And thank you for using your Scottish literature skills to quote Hume 3 times, I think, during your talk, which was much appreciated. There's a lady here who had the hand up first, so if you could, Jane, you put your hand up and someone will get the mic to you. And this lady here has been asking for a while. So let's take these 2 and let's make them fairly swift, and then maybe we can slip in 2 or 3 more before we close.
I'm a woman, I will talk forever. Lock the doors, we're here all night.
Jane Bauer, the SNP have made a great deal of what they will do under independence. They're going to create a sunlit upland and do all sorts of wonderful things. And by contrast, the Unionists have not really said a great deal about what they're going to do. there's been an implication that we'll stick with a status quo, but there is no status quo in the UK today. Institutionally and economically, we've been for quite a long time in a period of very rapid change. So what is the vision for the future in the UK if we all hang in there?
Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed listening to what you had to say, but I don't think you really quite answered Mr. Reid behind me, Mr. Reid's questions in the way that I understood them, which I don't want to speak for him, but I thought he was asking about happiness about as much as about GDP, and more concretely, I think he was arguing that it could be said, and it is being said, that there's an analogy between the UK's position vis-à-vis the EU and at least many Scottish views vis-à-vis the UK. And I think he was asking, how was it the Prime Minister could think in the way he does about the UK and the EU and not recognise that something similar is going on within the UK? And I think your answer was much more about what other member states were also saying rather than the internal dimension.
Okay. First of all, Jane, to slightly sort of disagree with you, the Liberal Democrats have said what they want to do in terms of constitutional change and reform. They put out a paper under Mingus Campbell's name. He led a review. It was kind of like the Steele report, but had a few things missing and a few things added. And was based on the federalism model. I personally don't think that a federal UK is what I want to see, nor do I think that it's particularly practical when you have the size of states being so different within a federation, to have one that is so dominant. I think that leads to huge questions in terms of stress and strain. The Labour Party are doing a review, which they'll bring out in, as I believe, March, in time for their conference, talking about where they believe the future would go and to lay out their vision for the future. And as I said in my speech, we'll be doing ours in May. But I think what's fundamental to all of us is the idea that we do believe that in devolution, we believe in decision-making closer to people, but we also believe that there is such a thing as the UK too, and that there are certain issues that underpin that UK. For me, I think there is a sense of social solidarity as well as political ones, and that can be expressed in policies. So, for example, I think that it is right and proper that a pensioner in Cardiff gets the same in her pension as a pensioner in Kirkcaldy, because they've both been asked to contribute the same over their lifetime. These are things that come under the social union part of that. There has been a point mooted about whether, once the referendum's done and if Scotland chooses to stay within the UK, and we look at some of the changes that we want to make to our democratic system, we also do something different too, and we get everybody, including non-politicians, around a table to have a discussion about what it is that makes the UK. And I was asked to contribute, nearly a couple of years ago now, to the Constitutional Affairs Select Committee at Westminster, who sat in Edinburgh, about whether there should be a kind of royal commission or a convention to look at what makes up our United Kingdom. And I said that I was fully in agreement with that, and I know that Douglas Alexander has gone on, from Labour, has gone on to talk about it several times since then. This idea that for me, I think that developments and devolution have kind of happened in a binary way. So you've seen Holyrood and Westminster develop. So you had the Calman Commission, you had the Scotland Act, all the rest of it. You've had Cardiff Bay and Westminster. You've had a sort of bilateral development there with the first Silk Report and now Silk 2 coming out. You've had local government regions in England under the Mackay Report looking at Westminster. You've had changes to what's happened in Stormont too, and that's been binary. What we haven't done in this, I like you, believe quite a fast-changing sort of decade and a half, is we haven't actually all sat down together and said, and what is it that ties us together? What is it that underpins us? What is it that we believe makes us a nation state while we have all of these separate nations? And I think that that's probably an exercise that that I would back and I would like to see, and I think that would be useful for us going forward. But
before we move on to the next question, can I pick you up a little bit more?
I wasn't done yet, but carry on.
Apologies for interrupting. Do you want to carry on, or can I ask?
Yeah, well, there's just one more point that I would make, which is in terms of seeing devolution as being fast-moving. I mean, I don't think that should surprise anyone. I don't think when, particularly in a Scottish context, We created a parliament for the first time in 300 years. For all of the wealth of experience that was around the table, your Donald Dewars and your Canon Kenyon Wrights and others, that we would ever have got everything right first time. And I think that there is a sense of which all of those ideas that we wanted to see going forward had to be stress tested against life in Scotland. And parliaments don't exist for their own self, and politics doesn't exist to serve itself. Both of these things exist in order to make the lives of individual people and groupings and communities and institutions all work better. And how do we make ourselves, the happier society that you were talking about, how do we make ourselves go forward into this world? So I don't think it should be a huge surprise to people that we didn't get Holyrood right first time. But I don't think that means that we should give up on it. And independence kills devolution stone dead. That's what it does. Sorry, Jeremy.
No, well, thank you, Ruth. I just was going to go back really on this issue of what comes after a no vote. I mean, I think you're quite rightly pressing that, we're all pressing that we understand what yes means, and the discussion about the currency is a crucial part of that as to what it could be. But I think it's also important that we get as good a feel as we can on what no means. 9 days ago, Willie Rennie announced at the same podium that would have Ming too, that he'd ask Ming Campbell to look at, with the other parties at Westminster and Holyrood, about what they might agree together as a package that could be put together for further devolution, further change, and that he would ask Sir Ming to report back within a few weeks. Now, you're talking about a report from Lord Strathclyde in May. I understand the timetable you have. You said the Lib Dems are already there, the Labour are reporting in March. Now, I just worry about the time that's elapsing. First of all, to get a considered view of what the three unionist parties might deem appropriate, and then to find some reassurance for the Scottish voters that actually that was very likely to happen in the event of independence being rejected, rather than the view, well, you've had your chance, now we'll move on to other matters. So how can you frame up what no would mean in a way that voters would find convincing as a cross-party view and one that was likely to be implemented?
Well, first of all, I don't believe that there will be a detailed cross-party agreement before the referendum. No, none of the parties have ever said that they were going to do that. And what I think is interesting is that the referendum has kind of thrown the cat among the pigeons, in that before the referendum was on the table, people understood, not just in Scotland but across the whole UK, that what happened was you had manifestos that were published before elections, you went to the electorate, people voted, the government then had a mandate to institute what was in their manifesto. Now, these manifestos differed from party to party to party. And what I have said with the Strathclyde report is that will inform the Conservative manifesto for 2015. So should the Conservatives be in government post then, that is what we're looking at. So, politics doesn't stop because there's a referendum. So I think, does that kind of come back on you?
So what you're saying is that there will be ideas floating around from the three different parties firming up, but we will have no firm view as to further, as Calman 2 or whatever. I accept the change is inevitable, and that the first Parliament was a start. We've had the Calman report. We will have further change inevitably, but we won't have any clarity on what that change will be when we step in the polling booth in September.
But that's kind of natural too, because the decision that we're being asked to make is, do you want to stay part of a club or leave a club? So you make a decision. If you decide to stay part of it, right, let's have a conversation about how we want that club to be run. And that's the kind of natural order of things too, I think.
Well, let's leave it there.
Okay, there was the lady down here who I can't ignore because she said that I didn't answer the first time to the first gentleman, so I'll ask again. In terms of happiness versus GDP, as far as I'm aware, there is only one country in the world that measures gross national happiness, and I think that's Bhutan. So I'm sorry that we don't have that index, but the more substantive point you made about arguments for Scotland within a United Kingdom union and the arguments for the UK's position within a European union, no, I take that on board, and I think what the Prime Minister has been saying is that he wants to review what's going on in the European Union. He wants to make some changes to the ways in which we interact with the European Union. And then he wants to get a mandate for us to continue being in that. And he will campaign to stay in because he recognises free trade across Europe. He recognises some of the benefits of that. But there are some things that are in there too, which do work against us, and he would like to see those changed. He also says that because if you're under 56 years old, you have never been asked about your position on Europe, now is probably a good time to have an MOT for that too. And as somebody who has never had a vote in their lifetime as to whether we should be in or out of the European Union, when it has so much impact on our lives, you know, I think it's only fair too that every now and again we go to the country and say, are you still involved in that?
That not make it more sympathetic to the concerns that people are expressing in Scotland as being parallel, as it were, at a different level?
Well, I think this referendum for the Scottish independence also gives people an opportunity to say, yes, this is something that we want to maintain a part of. So, while it's not completely congruent, I think that there are similarities that both sides can draw from this, and I absolutely take your point on board.
Thank you very much. Now we've time for two more questions, I think, and there have been people here. The gentleman there and the lady there have had their hands up for a while, so if we can take those two. I'm afraid that's going to be the end.
My name's Linda Holt. I'm really sorry to labour the point that lots of other people have made as well about the lack of a positive vision, really, and I completely understand that it's incredibly difficult for the Yes campaign because you're three separate parties, and in a way the White Paper isn't a vision for independence. It's a party political manifesto for the next election. The things that, I mean, it confuses those two things. It's all about what the SNP would do. I mean, they sort of say independence is really, you know, it's about the other parties too, and they'd have their visions and there'd be an election, but actually it's the SNP selling particular SNP policies. So I see the difficulty for you, but you also said we need to have a vision now in which we revive the union and what that means, and I don't see that. I mean, I see all the structural problems for you, and I see why you have to talk about the risks, but all the time the campaign is slipping into negativity. And I think that is turning people off. So, and the other problem I think is very much that you can make the point in Scotland, but it's not coming strongly, the positive vision isn't coming strongly from London. David Cameron isn't telling us why Scotland is really important to the Union. Maybe that's a problem if he says, you know, too much about that, because then that feeds into, well, Scotland should do it on its own. I don't know.
Thank you. And the last question, so make it a cracker.
No pressure.
No pressure, then. I'm Bruce Beveridge. I'm president of the Law Society of Scotland. We are, in fact, a happy organisation, and we do measure that. This touches on one or two of the more recent questions, I think, but early in the new year, Ipsos Mori polling results were released, which talked about how well informed people felt around the referendum debate. They showed that very few people felt very well informed, about 40% falling to 10% for women, that significantly fewer than 50% thought that the issues they were interested in were being covered, again falling further for women, and about 2/3 felt they didn't know whether or not they could believe the information that they were being given. I think my question to you is, what would you do differently between now and voting day to try and address that, despite the amount of information that's out there?
Okay. First of all, with Linda, I absolutely agree that the white paper isn't a white paper in the sense of the word that anyone would understand it. It is a political document, and it does put forward only one vision, and that's the SNP's one. And I think you've seen over the currency issues that have been raised today, you see huge divergence within some people within the Yes camp. So people like Jim Sillars, Patrick Harvey, people, I believe Colin Fox as well at the Scottish Socialist Party, do want to have a separate currency, whereas it's the SNP's position that there should be a currency union. So I think there is that. In terms of the positive vision, I understand that it can seem negative when there is an assertion made that is then challenged, that the people who challenge an assertion look like they're saying no, or that's difficult, or that's wrong, or that's negativity. But there is an element to which we cannot let assertions which are patently untrue stand, because then that feeds into Bruce's point of feeding misinformation to people. If the government of the country stands up and says, we have legal advice that says that we can quite happily and quite merrily continue within the European Union as a member state, and there is no risk to that, it is incumbent upon us as opposition parties to say, well, one, that's not true, we don't believe it, show us it, what is going on. And then actually you find out that the legal advice never existed in the first place. And there is a responsibility on us to challenge assertions which are clearly not true or do misinform the public out there. And I understand how that can be negativity. However, I believe that there is a positive case to be made. I try and talk not just about why we're better off as part of the United Kingdom, but why we share our country with people throughout the United Kingdom. I mean, why we're not a separate people, why we're not a wedge, things that I believe matter when it comes to looking at ourselves and our people. I touched on it today, but, even just in my own personal situation, I live in Glasgow. My sister lives in Newcastle. My best mate, since I was 7 years old at primary school, lives in Liverpool. You could not find 3 post-industrial cities that are closer together in terms of history, in terms of people, in terms of humour, in terms of all of these different things. And the idea that you would put a false barrier between them, I just find absurd. And I think talking about things at a level at which people can visualise and relate to in their own lives is a positive way of looking at it. And I'm really sorry if you don't think that the Prime Minister has been positive enough. I thought the speech he made in the Chris Hoy velodrome, in the velodrome where Chris Hoy won all of his medals in London just last week, I thought was a hugely positive review of not just Scotland would miss out if it stopped being part of the UK, but was specifically talking to people in England, Wales and Northern Ireland and saying, look, we would be poorer as a nation too. And while you do not have a vote in this referendum, and it's right that you don't, this is a decision for the people of Scotland, you do have a voice. Pick up the phone to people. Talk to people that you know in Scotland. Talk to your family members. Talk to your friends, your colleagues, your business associates, and say, look, we would be worse off without you. We want to keep you. And I thought that was a hugely positive intervention from the Prime Minister. And I want to see more of it. And perhaps we will over the coming months. Perhaps we will see the rhetoric. We'll see the interventions increase. But it's not just about politicians. There is an incumbency on everybody in Scotland in this debate to get involved and to put their head above the parapet. Whether that's business, whether that's charities, which are cross-subsidised by other parts of the UK or work internationally, whether that's people that are involved in churches. And I know from conversations that I've had with faith leaders that they were very upset that, for example, in the White Paper, there is nothing to say what is the role of faith in an independent Scotland. Is there not one? We need people to come forward and enter this debate because this isn't just a debate for politicians. And, I'm not going to win this referendum, and neither is Alex Salmond or Nicola Sturgeon or Joanne Lamont or Willie Rennie. Ordinary people talking to their friends and their family about the stuff that Bruce is talking about, things that matter to them, will win this debate for one side or the other. And I think if I can come on to Bruce's point, you're right. There is no top 3 things that everybody wants to know about. People have different views and different visions and different cares and different concerns. And for some people, it will be the macroeconomic policy of a putative, independent state. For others, it will be, do I have to pay a subscription to get Strictly Come Dancing on the BBC? And the people who know and who best know how to answer those questions are the people that I was talking to one of the earlier speakers about, the sort of army of folk up and down the country that are speaking to the people that they know, whether they're wearing jackets that say Better Together or jackets that say Yes Scotland. Because, if you're in the BAE shipyards that we're looking at redundancies, if you're in INEOS at Grangemouth, talk to your workmates about what you see as the best institution for you, what gives you safety and security in your job. If you're, a terrible gogglebox that never watches live telly and only watches the iPlayer, speak to someone in Ireland and find out that it's €6.99 a month to get the iPlayer, and you've got to put up with adverts, and it's all of these different arguments that are going to affect different people. And what I tell the people that I work with, both within the Conservative family and without, is, it's not conversations on TV that's going to win this. It's conversations at the school gate, at the church flower group, at the local amateur dramatic society, in the workplace canteen. It's going to be people that decide this debate. And you know what? That's exactly how it should be. Exactly how it should be.
Ruth, thank you very much. Well, I think that just picking up Bruce's last point, what we've tried to do in these 5 events is make our contribution to an informed, evidence-based, non-partisan, but somewhat sceptical in the spirit of Hume, discussion of key issues. And I think we've learned a lot. Some of us will sit down early next month and talk about what we've learned and what we haven't. and see where we take it from there, because I hope that we can continue to inform the debate, because there's a long way to go. And I think it's crucial, and it is the most important decision that's been taken. I think it was Brian Taylor said to me that maybe in 200 years' time people will look back and say, that was an important year for Scotland, wasn't it? So I think we must not underestimate the importance of what's happening. And so far as what we're doing at David Hume Institute, we've got 3 more seminars coming up in the next 4 weeks, so it's not over yet, folks. You don't get... we've got David Bell and colleagues talking about immigration policy, which I think is fascinating, and as Ruth mentioned, that there's not, from social attitude surveys, evidence of a very different approach to immigration in Scotland as elsewhere, but the demographics are somewhat different. Fascinating issue. We've then got Paul Johnson of the IFS speaking at the Parliament on the Green Budget and implications through the public finances for Scotland in referendum year. Should be a cracker. And then Ian Marchant talking about the challenges facing the Scottish energy industry. And there's a lot of issues around energy, as we uncovered in a conversation we held last year. And Ian is a controversial figure who told me to put in the note, he is not afraid to speak his mind. So I think that guarantees something. But what else we should do after that, I think, is an issue for you people and for those we've dealt with in these 5 discussions to think about. Is there more we can do to contribute to the informed and evidence-based debate, to make sure the people who make the decision are best informed, and how can we get it out more? How can we get this out to a wider canvas? So those are issues that I want us to be thinking about. But in the meantime, it's time to have a glass of wine, but before that, I'd very much like you to thank our speaker today for a fascinating talk and a brilliant way of dealing with your questions. Thank you, Ruth.